Welcome back to the channel from Sri Lanka. For my final video in this island country, I've come to the historic seaport of Galle, a city of about 100,000 at the southwest corner of the country, and one that visitors usually try not to miss. Galle has the distinction of being Sri Lanka's oldest and historically most important seaport. Cinnamon and other spices have gone out from here since at least 1400 years before Christ. The Portuguese, Dutch, and British influenced Sri Lanka greatly during 4 centuries of colonization until independence in 1948. The difference with the Europeans is that after their invasion and occupation, they fortified the place. The Portuguese built a fort here. The Dutch completely rebuilt and expanded it. And when the British took over, they preserved and maintained it. It's only about a 10-minute tuk-tuk ride or taxi ride or train ride from Uluwatuna, the beach resort. But this place has a different feel to it. There are fewer people on the streets here who speak a language other than their own, and at least who speak English. And it has a kind of distant feeling, as if it's sort of off the tourist trail, which it clearly is not. Walled Galle Fort, heavily populated and splendidly preserved, is the most exclusive part of the city. It's where I'm headed, of course. But before I do, I want to show you one other place outside the fort's walls.
This is St. Mary's Cathedral, built under British rule, which since the 1890s continues to function as a cathedral for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Galle.
As I've mentioned in earlier videos, Sri Lanka is overwhelmingly Buddhist, about 70% of the country's population. Of the remainder, about 13% are Hindu, 10% are Muslim, and 7% claim to be Christian, most of those being Roman Catholic. Galle, however, skews differently. Here, nearly 95% of people claim to be Buddhist, while only about 1% are Christian, which makes this imposing Catholic cathedral, serving a small diocese, notable for its survival. Well, I've come to the fort, which occupies its own little seaside peninsula that is just to the south of what I guess you could call downtown Galle, where the railway station and the bus station are, not far from the outside of this fort. The main gate that I just passed through is the newer of 2 existing gates built in colonial times. The Dutch built the older one in 1669, closer to the seaside. The British opened a new main gate that more or less faced the interior, which was close to today's downtown. The current main entrance, by the way, was built by the British in 1873. And of course that pretty much coincided with the time that Galle was made the administrative center for the southern half of the island. The Portuguese took over Galle in 1505 and built the first fort here in 1587. The Dutch drove out the Portuguese in 1640 and shortly afterward built the great fortress that you see here, adding features over time. When the British pushed the Dutch from Ceylon in 1796, all of the fort's essentials were in place for occupation. They modified a few buildings. Hence, although the British occupied it for a century and a half after the Dutch, Galle Fort is often referred to as the Dutch fort. Of course, it's not all about the Dutch here. The British also left their mark. This beautiful Victorian Gothic revival style structure is All Saints Church, an Anglican church built on the site of the former Dutch courthouse in the 1870s. The inside of this church needs a little tender loving care, but it's still quite a remarkable place for the period that it represents. The heavy pews here with carvings of the Jewish Star of David, as well as the sanctuary, are made from Burmese teak. Maybe the most fascinating historical tidbit related to this church involves what was here before it, and namely an old courthouse during colonial days, Dutch colonial days. In all likelihood, it was strictly coincidence that it turned out this way, that the altar is located precisely at the spot where, during the courthouse days, the gallows once stood. The streets here are laid out in a rectangular grid pattern filled with low houses and verandas typical of Dutch colonial style. And there were and are nice peripheral streets around the edges of the fort with buildings on one side and the ramparts on the other. The street names are almost all Dutch, which seems exotic when you think about where you are in a mostly Buddhist Sinhalese culture on an island in the Indian Ocean. I'm on Moors Kramerstraat, or Moorish Peddler Street, famous in the early days as a place where Muslim Moors sold their wares. Muslim Moors are the descendants of Arab traders who came here starting in the 8th century. They're about 10% of the country's population and account for the presence of Islam here. One of the more interesting street name derivations is Chando Street, which is named after toddy tappers who owned coconut gardens and small distilleries. So I know you're wondering, well, what is a toddy tapper? Toddy is the name most used by Sri Lankans for what's also known as coconut wine, an alcoholic beverage created from the sap off palm trees. A person who extracts that sap is a toddy tapper. Everywhere you look, along every rampart, there are more watchtowers and places for soldiers who used to staff this guard tower to seek protection. They could poke muskets through the slender holes in these places, like the one I just entered, which I had to sort of squeeze into. It's about maybe 15 inches wide. And now to look out it is a difficult thing because the holes are very small. But let me see if I can poke my camera through one of them. Oh, that was a tight squeeze, and this is a small camera. But I think you see what I mean. Well, that would be tough duty all day if you were assigned to stand guard inside of one of those little posts. This bastion that I've just walked upon is called the Commandant's Bastion. And today it sort of resembles more like a Lover's Lane Bastion. You know, I kind of feel sorry for these couples because they're looking for a place to go to be alone. And that's pretty difficult inside Galle Fort, which is always teeming with people, no matter which little nook and cranny you find. It's not a kind of place where you should come and expect to be handed tourist maps. It just doesn't work that way here. You want to see something, you go find it, which isn't necessarily that easy without putting in the work of pounding the pavement. I've just walked through a charming little garden with old, humongous, spreading trees on a little plaza that sits between two distinctive looking colonial buildings that are still in use today as regional courthouses on opposite sides of this garden. And that's the case with much of what is old here. It's all old, and it's all been put to use, continues to be used. Well, the sign says authentic Dutch world charm. And that may be true of this fort, but several other things are true about it as well. And I feel as though I would be remiss if I didn't mention them. It is a World Heritage Site, but because it includes part of an active town, you can't just shut down a town. And that's understandable, but the thing that's disappointing here is there's very little in the way of traffic mitigation in these streets that are really not designed for a lot of traffic. They're supposed to be pedestrian streets for the most part. That's what people are doing here. They're coming here and walking, but it's constantly bombarded by vehicles. And the other thing that I would have to say is that this is a price trap. This morning, for example, I was not able to have breakfast at my guest house just due to circumstances, and I thought I would just hold off until I arrived at the fort. And I did, and I had a decent breakfast. I'm not complaining about it, but it cost about $10. The same breakfast, if it weren't jacked up for a certain sort of tourist, would cost about $3 here. If you come a long distance to come to this place, then it's certainly worth doing. But I think it's also worth noting that there's a little price gouging and not enough attention to detail here to make this the kind of experience that it could be and should be. Well, I've come to the seaward side of the fort. At its south end, on the water, near the lighthouse to where I'm headed, is a beautiful little white sand beach. The lighthouse is the most popular structure within this World Heritage Site for which the British were responsible. This is Sri Lanka's oldest light station, built in 1939, near the end of the British reign here, and replacing a smaller lighthouse nearby from the mid-1800s. This lighthouse is easy to spot by boats entering the bay from any direction. But like many beautiful old lighthouses elsewhere, the people who pay most attention to it these days are camera-toting tourists. There are all sorts of quirky tidbits of history associated with this fort. I've been trying to find a particular thing on this fort, and I have not found it. I'm talking about a breadfruit tree. The breadfruit tree is of the mulberry family and produces large fruit that are common in Sri Lanka and many tropical places around the world. The tree was introduced in Ceylon by the Dutch here at this fort, and by some accounts for nefarious reasons. It is said that the early Dutch brought the tree here believing that its edible attributes might be of use to either killing the local population or at least making them sick. Well, if so, it was quite the failure, for the locals found a neutralizer in the coconut palm. Native Sri Lankans mixed coconut with the breadfruit, and rather than harming them, it evolved into a tasty, not to mention nourishing, delicacy. And these days, the trees that were allegedly introduced here with bad intentions grow everywhere in Sri Lanka. Well, this does it for me from Sri Lanka. I'll be leaving here to return to Colombo, from where in a couple of days I'll catch a flight to my next destination in the south of India. Thanks so much for watching and for subscribing. Until I see you from India, ciao and peace.